The silence was the first sign that the foundation had cracked. It was a structural silence, a load-bearing quiet that the old house, with its familiar groans and sighs, was never meant to support. Liam felt it the moment he stepped through the door, the key turning in the lock with a sound that seemed too loud, too solitary. The air was still, holding the scent of lemon cleaner and another, fainter perfume that was already beginning to feel like a memory. He called her name. The sound was absorbed by the stillness, leaving no echo. He walked through the living room, his work boots leaving dusty footprints on the aggressively clean hardwood floors. Everything was in its place, but it was the tidiness of a museum, not a home. It was the sterile order of a place that had been abandoned. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, then you must understand the geography of this particular silence, the specific architecture of this singular moment of devastation. It was not a void, it was a presence, a monument to an absence. On the granite countertop, the one he had cut and polished himself over 2 weekends, lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. Beside it, glinting under the recessed kitchen lighting he had installed, sat her wedding ring. The cruelty of that placement was precise, an architect's detail. The ring was not thrown in anger, but placed with the care of a final, declarative statement. He picked it up. It was cold, colder than metal had any right to be. His thumb, calloused and rough from gripping hammers and hauling steel, traced the smooth, unbroken circle. He had thought it was a symbol of permanence. He had been wrong. He had built this house with his own hands, but he had built their life on a fault line he never knew was there. He unfolded the note. The words were spare, written in her flawless, looping cursive. She was gone. She was with Marcus. It was not a decision made in haste, she wrote, but a choice for a future she deserved, a future that was not coated in sawdust and hypotheticals. She was sorry for the pain, but not for the choice. It was a resignation letter from their life together. Below the main text, a postscript, almost an afterthought. I've told Chloe I have to go away for a long trip for work. It's better that way. She'll understand eventually. The name hit him like a physical blow. Chloe, his sister, 16 years old, fragile as spun glass since their parents' accident 2 years prior. They had taken her in, he and Sarah, promising to be the steel frame that would let her rebuild. He had thought it was a shared promise. Now he saw it was just another project he had undertaken alone. He ran up the stairs, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He found Chloe in her room, curled on her bed, a different, smaller note crumpled in her hand. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Sarah had not even given her the dignity of a gentle lie. Her note to the girl was a blade of pure, selfish convenience, telling her she needed to start being more independent, that Liam would take care of things now. The secondary burden, left with the cold precision of the ring on the counter. He was no longer just an abandoned husband. He was the sole girder for a life far more fragile than his own. The quiet house was no longer a home. It was a wreckage site, and he was the only one left to sift through the debris. The first week was a study in numb automation. Liam moved through the skeletal framework of his life on autopilot, his body a machine, performing tasks his mind refused to acknowledge. He made breakfast for Chloe, a silent, hollow-eyed girl who moved around the house like a ghost. He drove her to school. He went to the workshop, the cavernous, dusty space that housed his fledgling company, AuraBuild. He stared at the half-finished modular frame in the center of the floor, a skeleton of steel and recycled composites. It was supposed to be the future of sustainable housing. Now it just looked like a cage of broken promises, The smell of ozone from the welder and the sharp tang of cut metal, scents that usually filled him with a sense of purpose, now just smelled like failure. His two employees, a young, eager kid named Ricky and a grizzled old carpenter named Sal, moved around him with a cautious deference, their usual boisterous banter reduced to respectful murmurs. They knew, the whole small town probably knew, he would return home to the sterile silence and find Chloe exactly where he had left her, staring at a screen, the blue light painting her face in shades of sorrow. He would try to talk to her, his words clumsy and heavy as bricks. "How was school?" A shrug. "Do you have homework?" A nod. He was a builder, a man who understood stress loads and tolerances, the language of concrete and steel. The delicate, fractured architecture of a teenage girl's grief was a blueprint he could not read. He was failing her, and this new failure was 100 times heavier than his own. The house remained unnervingly clean, a testament to Sarah's final act of departure. But beneath the surface, chaos was creeping in. A fine layer of dust began to settle. Dishes piled up in the sink. Laundry baskets overflowed. The meticulous order was giving way to the entropy of despair. The second week, the calls started. Sarah's mother, her voice a torrent of shrill accusations, blaming him for not being ambitious enough, for not giving her daughter the life she was entitled to. She had to choose, Liam. A woman like Sarah can't live on potential and sawdust. Marcus can provide for her. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He just let the words wash over him, then quietly hung up the phone. Each call was another tap of the hammer against a support beam that was already splintering. At his other job, the contract work he did for a large construction firm, to keep cash flowing while AuraBuild found its footing, his distraction became a liability. Frank, the site foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard-won experience, pulled him aside.
"Kellen," Frank began, his voice rough as gravel, "your head's not here. You're a danger to yourself and my crew. I've got you on light duty, but if you can't get your mind right, you're off the site. I'm sorry for your troubles, son, but this job doesn't wait for broken hearts." Liam just nodded, the shame burning in his gut. He was a man who prided himself on his work, on the solid reliability of his presence. Now he was being treated like a novice, a liability. The professional humiliation was a new layer of weight on his already overloaded frame. The evenings grew longer, darker. He would sit in his workshop after putting Chloe to bed, the finances spread out on his drafting table under the harsh glare of a single lamp. The numbers were brutal. AuraBuild was bleeding money. The small contracts they had were barely covering the cost of materials. His personal savings, which he had been pouring into the company, were nearly gone. The mortgage payment on the house was due.
A notice with red lettering had arrived in the mail. It felt like watching a slow-motion collapse, the groaning of stressed metal before the final, catastrophic failure. He was overwhelmed, a man trapped in a structure that was caving in on all sides, the exits blocked, the air growing thin. The breaking point did not arrive with a dramatic crash or a shouted revelation. It came on a Tuesday night under the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage-turned-workshop. It was late. Rain lashed against the metal door, each drop a tiny, insistent tap. Chloe had finally, after days of silence, had a meltdown over a math problem she couldn't solve, her frustration and grief erupting in a torrent of tears that had left them both shaken and exhausted. He had managed to calm her down, get her to bed, but the encounter had scraped him raw. Now he was in the workshop, trying to recalibrate the plasma cutter, a delicate, critical piece of equipment they needed for a small but vital job the next day. His hands were shaking with fatigue. The numbers on the calibration screen blurred. He was inputting the sequence, his movements clumsy, when his elbow bumped a tray of precision-cut steel shims. They scattered across the grimy concrete floor with a series of tiny metallic clicks. It was nothing, a minor inconvenience, a 5-minute cleanup job, but in that moment it was everything. It was the spilled coffee on the day of a final exam. It was the flat tire on the way to the hospital. It was the single, final straw. The sound of the tiny metal pieces hitting the floor echoed the sound of his own internal structure shattering. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure, animal despair he did not recognize as his own. He dropped the wrench he was holding. It clanged against the concrete, a loud, definitive punctuation mark on his defeat. He did not scream, he did not sob. He simply slid down the side of the cold metal workbench, his legs giving out from under him, and sat on the floor amidst the scattered shims. He put his head in his hands, the rough texture of his palms against his face, the smell of grease and metal filling his senses. He sat there in the humming silence of the workshop, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof. And for the first time, he let the full, crushing weight of it all descend. He had hit the foundation. There was nowhere lower to go. He did not know how long he sat there, a statue of defeat on the cold concrete floor. Time had dissolved into the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the low hum of the dormant machinery. The world had shrunk to the space between his hands, the darkness behind his eyes. He was brought back by a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the air. He lifted his head slowly, his neck stiff. Chloe stood in the doorway, a small silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. She held a thick wool blanket, one of their mother's old Afghans, clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that was not for herself, but for him. She did not speak. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the dusty floor, and draped the blanket over his slumped shoulders. Then she slid down to the floor beside him, tucked her knees to her chest, and rested her head against his arm. They sat together in the quiet, a tableau of shared brokenness. Her simple, silent act of care was more powerful than any words of encouragement could ever have been. It was an anchor. In her presence, he was not just a failed husband or a failing business owner. He was her brother, her protector, the only solid thing she had left. He looked down at her head, resting on his bicep, at the trust in that simple gesture, and in that moment a flicker of something that had long been extinguished, a pilot light of resolve ignited in the cold, dark furnace of his chest. He would not let her down. He could not. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. They were stained with grease, crisscrossed with pale scars from slipped wrenches and sharp steel edges. They were builders' hands. They knew how to take raw materials, wood, stone, metal, and impose order upon them to create strength and shelter from chaos. For weeks he had been drowning, passively accepting the flood. Now a new thought took root, as solid and unyielding as rebar set in concrete. He would not sink. He would build. He would tear this ruined life down to the bedrock, salvage what was usable, and build something new. Something stronger, something on a foundation so deep and so solid that no storm, no earthquake, no departure could ever shake it again. The decision was not a shout. It was a quiet, internal vow, a contract signed with himself in the silent presence of his sister. The next morning, he moved with a purpose he had not felt in months. He showered, shaved, and put on a clean shirt. He made a proper breakfast, and when Chloe came into the kitchen, he looked her in the eye and smiled, a real smile. "We're going to be okay?" he said, his voice steady. She stared at him for a long moment, then gave a small, hesitant nod. It was the first crack of light in a long winter. After dropping her at school, he did not go to the workshop. He went to his bedroom, to the small, velvet-lined box in his sock drawer. Inside lay a vintage timepiece, a beautiful steel chronograph his father had given him on his 21st birthday. It was his one true heirloom, a symbol of a different, simpler time, of a father's belief in his son. He had always imagined giving it to his own son one day. He took it out, the weight of it familiar in his palm. He looked at the steady sweep of the second hand, marking time. Then, with a deep breath that felt like severing a final anchor to his past, he closed the lid. He drove downtown to a reputable jeweler who also dealt in estate pieces. The man, old and meticulous, examined the watch under a loupe, humming in appreciation. He named a price. It was fair. It was also just enough. Just enough to fix the plasma cutter, to make payroll for Sal and Ricky for another 2 weeks, and to cover the most urgent part of the mortgage payment to stave off the foreclosure proceedings. Liam took the deal without haggling. Walking out of the shop, his wrist felt unnaturally light. He had traded a piece of his history for a few more days of a future. It was a brutal transaction, but it was the first concrete step. It was the first block laid in the foundation of his new life. Later that week, a woman appeared at the workshop. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, and eyes that seemed to see through the surface of things. She introduced herself as Eleanor Vance, an architect from Sterling Cooper Design, the large firm Aurabuild had been trying to court for a partnership. She was there, she stated coolly, to conduct a final viability assessment. Her tone suggested it was a formality before they officially passed on the investment. She walked through the space with a clipboard, her expression unreadable. She tapped on the modular frame, examined the welds, and scrutinized his blueprints, which were laid out, coffee-stained and covered in scribbled revisions, on the main drafting table. She was relentless. Her questions were like a drill boring into the weakest points of his operation. Your supply chain is inefficient. Your business plan is based on optimistic projections with no stress testing. Your margin for error is non-existent. She was not being cruel. She was being clinical, dissecting the business with surgical precision. The old Liam would have been defensive, his pride wounded. The new Liam, the one forged in the crucible of the last month, simply answered every question with blunt, unvarnished honesty. "You're right," he said. "It's a mess. But the core technology is sound. The design is revolutionary. It just needs a chance." She listened, her sharp gaze never leaving his face. She saw the exhaustion, the grease under his fingernails, but she also saw the unyielding belief in his eyes. She saw the grit. At the end of the day, she packed up her briefcase. "My report to my firm will be accurate," she said, the word hanging in the air with stark finality. He expected that to be the end of it. But as she was about to leave, she paused at the door. She turned back, pulled a pen from her jacket, and walked back to his messy blueprints. She began to speak, her voice crisp and professional, pointing with the tip of her pen. "Your thermal bridging issue here can be solved with a composite insulator. If you restructure the load-bearing points this way, you can reduce steel costs by 12%. And your proposal to my firm is buried in jargon. Lead with the why, not the how." For 10 minutes, she delivered a masterclass in architectural and business strategy. Then she handed him a business card. "My report will be what it will be," she said. "What you do with this information is up to you." And then she was gone, leaving him standing in the middle of his workshop with the first glimmer of a real, professional lifeline. It was not pity, it was a challenge. And it was exactly what he needed. The first year was a blur of relentless grinding labor. Liam lived by the harsh arithmetic of survival. 24 hours in a day, minus 6 for sleep, minus the time for Chloe, left a precious, finite resource he poured into work. Guided by the brutal honesty of Elena's impromptu consultation, he began to rebuild Aura Build from the inside out. He spent his nights not just drafting new designs, but learning the language of business. He checked out books from the library on accounting, marketing, and corporate law, their pages quickly becoming dog-eared and stained with coffee. He rewrote his business plan, stripping away the optimistic jargon and replacing it with cold, hard data and conservative projections. He took on more contract work with Frank's firm, swallowing his pride and working the most grueling jobs, late-night concrete pours in the freezing rain, weekend demolition jobs that left his body aching and covered in a thick layer of grime. Every dollar he earned was triaged, a portion for the mortgage, a portion for food and Chloe's needs, and every remaining cent funneled into the hungry maw of the workshop. Eleanor became a recurring, almost spectral presence. Her firm, intrigued by her revised report, which, to Liam's shock, highlighted the high-risk, high-reward potential of his core technology, had not given a definitive no. They had deferred, putting Aura Build in a state of corporate purgatory. But Eleanor herself seemed personally invested. She would appear at the workshop some evenings, dressed in her sharp architectural attire, a stark contrast to the dusty chaos. She would say she was following up or checking on a potential asset, but her visits grew longer, less formal. She would lean over the drafting table, her initial, almost adversarial criticism softening into collaborative brainstorming. Have you considered using a cross-laminated timber frame for the residential pods? It's lighter, more sustainable, and the aesthetic is popular right now, she would suggest, sketching a quick, elegant modification to his design. They formed an unlikely partnership over lukewarm coffee and blueprints spread under the harsh shop lights. He brought the raw, hands-on knowledge of materials and construction. She brought the refined, theoretical understanding of design, space, and market dynamics. He learned from her, absorbing her vocabulary, her way of seeing a building not just as a structure, but as a system interacting with its environment and its inhabitants. She, in turn, seemed fascinated by his intuitive grasp of physics and his relentless work ethic. She saw the genius buried beneath the fatigue. His relationship with Chloe was undergoing its own slow reconstruction. The gaping wound of her mother's abandonment was still there, but Liam was a constant, steady presence. He made sure he was home for dinner every night, even if it meant returning to the workshop after she was asleep. He attended every parent-teacher conference, sitting in the small chairs, his large, calloused hands looking out of place, listening intently to her teachers. He found a new way to connect with her. He started bringing her to the workshop on weekends. He taught her how to read a blueprint, how to measure twice and cut once, how to safely use a drill. He gave her small projects, building a birdhouse, sanding a piece of reclaimed wood. In the tangible, focused work, she found an outlet for her anxiety. Her hands, like his, became creators. She was still a quiet girl, but the haunted, fragile look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a spark of concentration and competence. The second year brought more of the same grinding work, but with a sliver of momentum. They had managed to secure a few more small-scale jobs, a custom backyard office pod, a series of minimalist bus shelters for a neighboring town. These were not glamorous projects. They were won on razor-thin margins and completed through sheer force of will, with Liam, Sal, and Ricky working punishing hours. Elena often acted as an unpaid consultant, reviewing his bids, suggesting material substitutions that would save crucial pennies, and using her own reputation to vouch for the quality of his work. Their dynamic was still undefined, a careful dance around the personal. It was a partnership forged in the trenches of professional survival. He knew she had a life outside his dusty workshop, a world of art gallery openings and dinner parties with colleagues, but she increasingly chose to spend her evenings with him, arguing over the optimal placement of a window or the structural integrity of a new joint design. The turning point arrived midway through the third year, disguised as a near-impossible challenge. A local non-profit had secured a grant to build a new community centre in a low-income neighbourhood, but their budget was laughably small. Every conventional construction firm had turned them down. In desperation, they approached AuraBuild. The project was a massive risk. The budget left no room for error, the timeline was brutally short, and the public scrutiny would be intense. Sal and Ricky told him it was suicide. Liam looked at the plans, at the desperate hope in the eyes of the non-profit's director. He saw a chance to prove his model on a larger scale. He turned to the one person whose opinion had become as critical as his own. He and Elena spent an entire weekend locked in the workshop, tearing the project apart and putting it back together. She redesigned the layout on the fly, simplifying the structure without sacrificing functionality. He re-engineered the modular components for maximum efficiency in fabrication and assembly. They created a plan that was audacious, borderline insane, but theoretically possible. "We can do this," he said, looking at the final drawings, a sense of exhilaration cutting through his chronic exhaustion. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but certain. It was in that moment, in the shared belief in the face of impossible odds, that he realized the foundation between them had shifted. It was no longer just professional respect, it was something deeper, stronger. They won the bid. The next 6 months were a controlled inferno. Liam was on site from before dawn until after dusk, managing every detail. Elena was there every day after her own job, her hard hat becoming a permanent fixture, her sharp eyes catching details his tired ones missed. They worked as a single unit, their communication seamless, often non-verbal, a raised eyebrow, a quick nod, a shared glance across the noisy construction site. The community centre rose from the dirt with astonishing speed, a testament to the efficiency of his modular system. The day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Frank, his old, grizzled foreman, showed up. He had heard about the project and had come to see it for himself, his expression skeptical. He walked through the finished building, running his hand over the exposed beams, tapping on the walls, his critical eye missing nothing. He came out into the sunlight where Liam was standing, watching families from the neighborhood explore their new center. Frank stood beside him for a long time, silent. Then he cleared his throat. "I was wrong about you, Kellen," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion he was not comfortable showing. This is the future. I'm retiring next year. I'm selling my house. I want to invest in this." Liam stared at him, stunned. Frank's life savings, his trust. It was more valuable than any bank loan. It was the capital they needed. It was the vote of confidence that would change everything. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone, Liam and Elena stood alone in the main hall of the finished center, the space quiet and filled with the smell of new paint and possibility. "He wants to invest," Liam said, the words still feeling unreal. "We did it." "Yes," she said, turning to him, her face illuminated by the soft light coming through the large windows she had designed. "We did." There was no grand, dramatic moment. He simply reached out and took her hand, her fingers laced with his, It felt natural, inevitable, like the final piece of a complex structure clicking into place. It was not the fiery, desperate passion he had known before. This was different. This was quiet. This was solid. It was a structure built not on fleeting promises, but on a shared foundation of concrete, steel, and tireless work. It was a partnership that had been stress-tested and proven true. The next 4 years were an ascent. Frank's investment was the catalyst, the spark that ignited the fuel Liam and Elena had so painstakingly gathered. It gave Aurabuild legitimacy and, more importantly, the operating capital to scale. They moved out of the cramped garage and into a proper fabrication facility. They hired more staff, engineers, designers, skilled laborers who were drawn to the company's growing reputation for innovation. Liam's role underwent a profound transformation. The calluses on his hands began to fade as he spent less time wrestling with steel and more time wrestling with contracts, supply chains, and expansion strategies. He traded his worn work boots for polished leather shoes, his tool belt for a slim leather briefcase. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the corporate world, discovering he had a natural aptitude for strategy, a builder's patience applied to the long game of business. The stoicism that had once been a shield for his pain now became a formidable negotiating tool, an unreadable mask that kept competitors and partners alike off balance. Elena officially joined the company as chief architect and head of design within the first year of this new phase, resigning from her prestigious position at Sterling Cooper. It was a risk for her, leaving a secure, high-status job for a company that was still, in the grand scheme of things, a startup. But for them, it was the only logical next step. They were partners in every sense of the word. Her design ingenuity, combined with his engineering and fabrication prowess, created a synergy that was unstoppable. Aurabuild began to win awards, first small regional design prizes, then national sustainability awards. Their modular technology, once a dusty hobby, was now being hailed in architectural digests and business journals as a revolutionary force in the construction industry. The contracts followed, growing exponentially in scale and prestige. They moved from community centers to boutique hotels, then to multi-story office complexes and sprawling residential developments. Each project was a statement, a fusion of aesthetic beauty and radical efficiency. Liam, the man who once fought to keep the lights on in a garage, was now the CEO of a corporation valued in the tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. He became a name, a figure in the industry, the quiet, intense man who had come from nowhere and was reshaping the urban landscape. His temples began to show flecks of grey, fine lines etched themselves around his eyes, but they were the marks of focus, not despair. He had a weight to him now, the quiet authority of a man who had built his world with his own 2 hands and his own sharp mind. Their personal life evolved with the same steady, organic growth as their business. They bought a plot of land on a wooded hill overlooking the city, and together they designed and built their own home. It was an Aurabuild house, of course, a masterpiece of glass, steel, and warm wood, perfectly integrated into its natural surroundings. It was a home built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared struggle, its walls holding not the ghosts of betrayal, but the quiet hum of a deep and abiding love. Eleanor's presence was a calming constant in his life, a steady hand on his shoulder during late-night strategy sessions, a shared smile over breakfast as they looked out at the city they were helping to build. She became the mother Chloe had never truly had. She helped Chloe navigate the complexities of high school, edited her college application essays, and celebrated with unrestrained joy when Chloe was accepted into a top-tier engineering program. Chloe, no longer a fragile, haunted girl, had blossomed into a confident, brilliant young woman, her father's practicality and Eleanor's sharp intellect fused in her DNA. She spent her summers interning at Aurabuild, her presence in the fabrication facility a source of immense pride for Liam. He saw the cycle completing, the legacy he was building not just in steel and glass, but in family. The past became a distant country. The memory of Sarah, of the cold ring on the counter, and the crushing weight of abandonment faded into a dull, historical fact, a part of the origin story of the man he had become. He had built a fortress, not of walls to keep the world out, but of a life so full, so strong, and so real that the ghosts of the past could find no purchase. He had a partner who was his equal, a sister who was thriving, and an empire built not on speculation, but on substance. He was powerful, he was self-assured, he was healed, he was in control, and he assumed, in his quiet contentment, that the past was finished with him. It was a rare miscalculation. The past was never truly finished, it was merely waiting. The first tremor from the past arrived not as a scream, but as a whisper, printed in the black and white of a financial journal Liam was reading on a flight to Chicago. It was a small article, a business section footnote, about the spectacular collapse of Marcus Thorne's real estate empire. The language was dry, clinical, over-leveraged assets, market downturn, allegations of securities fraud. The flashy, high-rise luxury that Marcus had built his world upon was a house of cards, and the wind had finally picked up. Liam read the article twice, a strange, detached curiosity his only emotion. He felt no schadenfreude, no satisfaction. It was like reading about a storm in a distant country he had visited long ago. He folded the paper and turned his attention to the Aurabuild expansion plans laid out on his tablet. Marcus Thorne and his failed world had nothing to do with him. A few weeks later, the past walked into his lobby. He was in a meeting on the top floor of the Aurabuild Tower, the gleaming steel and glass skyscraper that served as their headquarters and the most potent symbol of their success. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, hesitant and confused. "Mr. Kellen, I apologize for the interruption, but there is a woman in the lobby, Sarah Kellen. She insists on seeing you. She says it's a personal matter." Liam's face remained a neutral mask, but inside, a cold, quiet mechanism clicked into place. 7 years. He had been waiting for this moment without even realizing it. "Thank you, Maria. I'll be down in a moment." He excused himself from the meeting, his movements calm and deliberate. As he rode the silent express elevator down 30 floors, he felt none of the old pain, none of the anger. He felt only a profound and weary sense of inevitability. The final piece of the old, broken structure had to be cleared away before the site could be truly considered finished. He saw her standing by the large glass windows of the lobby, looking small and out of place against the grand, minimalist space he and Elena had designed. She was thinner, and the expensive clothes she wore, a designer dress and handbag, were subtly but unmistakably worn, the shine of their newness long gone. The years had not been as kind to her as they had to him. They had taken something from her, a brightness, and replaced it with a brittle, hardened edge. She turned as he approached, and for a moment she seemed to search for the man she had left. She did not find him. She found a stranger in a perfectly tailored suit, a man whose quiet confidence was more intimidating than any display of wealth. "Liam," she said, her voice attempting a breathy, familiar warmth that didn't reach her eyes. "You look good." "Sarah," he replied, his tone polite, neutral. "What can I do for you?" She launched into the performance he had half expected. Her voice was thick with manufactured remorse. She was a victim. Marcus had been a monster, a liar who had used her and cast her aside when his empire crumbled. He had left her with nothing, less than nothing. She painted a picture of her own suffering, her hands gesturing dramatically, her eyes welling with tears that seemed calculated to elicit pity. She spoke of the good old days, of their first apartment, of the dreams they had shared, a revisionist history in which she was his steadfast muse. "I made a terrible mistake, Liam," she whispered, stepping closer, attempting to touch his arm. "I was young and foolish. I didn't understand what we had. I never should have left." Liam did not move. He listened patiently, his expression unchanging, as if he were listening to a pitch from a vendor he had no intention of hiring. He saw her not as the woman who had shattered his world, but as a strategic problem to be managed. When her torrent of words finally subsided, leaving her looking at him with an expression of desperate expectation, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He gestured to a sleek bench in the lobby. "Would you like a glass of water?" he asked, his voice betraying no emotion. The offer was so simple, so devoid of the pity or anger she had expected, that it completely disarmed her. It was the response of a man for whom she was no longer an emotional variable, but merely a minor, unexpected logistical issue. The performance had failed. And Liam knew, with the cold certainty of a structural engineer, that when the soft plea failed, the hard attack would come next. The shift was immediate. The mask of remorseful victimhood shattered, revealing the raw, ugly face of entitlement beneath. Sarah's tears dried instantly, her posture stiffening. The pity play had not worked on this new, colder version of Liam, so she would pivot to leverage. "I see," she said, her voice losing its breathy quality and taking on a hard, metallic edge. "You're not going to make this easy." "Make what easy, Sarah?" he asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Don't play dumb with me, Liam," she snapped. "I went to see a lawyer, a very good one. I wanted to see where I stood. And do you know what he told me? He told me that in this state, until a judge signs a decree, you are still legally married. We signed some papers, yes, but we never filed them. We are still married." Liam remained silent, his gaze steady. He let her play her hand. "That means," she continued, her voice rising with a triumphant, venomous glee, "that everything you've built, this whole company, this fancy building, it's marital property. It was all acquired during our marriage. Aura Build was started in our garage, Liam. I was there. I supported you in those early days." The lie was so audacious it was almost impressive. Her support had been a constant barrage of complaints about the dust, the noise, and the money he was wasting on his hobby. He remembered her calling it a worthless startup 100 times. "I am entitled to my share," she declared, her eyes sweeping around the cavernous, expensive lobby. "I'm entitled to half of everything." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial threat. "We can do this quietly, you and I, a simple settlement. You give me what I am owed and I disappear. Or we can do this publicly, a messy, ugly divorce. My lawyer will subpoena your records, your partner," she said the word with a particular sneer, "your employees. We'll drag it all out into the open. The world will hear about how the great Liam Kellen, the self-made man, built his empire on the back of his loyal, supportive wife and then tossed her aside. Think of what that will do to your company's reputation, to your stock price when you go public." It was pure blackmail, predicated on the assumption that he was the same man she had left, a man who would be cowed by public shame and emotional confrontation. She was trying to start a fire, assuming he was still living in a house made of wood. She had no idea he now lived in a fortress of steel and concrete. Liam finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should have your lawyer contact my lawyer," he said. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket, not his own, but that of his long-time corporate counsel, Arthur Vance, a quiet, formidable man in his late 60s. He handed it to her. He will handle all future communications on this matter. He turned to walk away. "You think you can just dismiss me?" she shrieked, her composure completely gone. "I will ruin you, Liam. I will take you for everything you have." He paused, but did not turn back. "Schedule the meeting, Sarah," he said over his shoulder, and then he walked toward the elevators without a second glance, leaving her standing alone in the center of the empire she had abandoned, a ghost screaming in a cathedral she could not touch. The meeting was set for a week later in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm downtown. The room was dominated by a vast, polished mahogany table that reflected the grey, overcast sky like a dark, still lake. Liam sat on one side, flanked by his lawyer, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a man of few words and immense presence, his silence more intimidating than another lawyer's blustering. Beside Liam sat Elena. She was not there as a legal necessity, but her presence was non-negotiable. She was his partner. Her name was on the company charter. She had co-signed the loans. She had co-authored the designs. She was a co-builder of this life, and she would be present for its defense. Her calm, steady posture was a silent rebuke to the entire proceeding. Sarah arrived a few minutes late, a deliberate power move, with her attorney in tow. The man, whose name was Donovan, was exactly the type Liam had expected: expensive suit, aggressive haircut, and the predatory smile of a shark that smelled blood in the water. They sat opposite Liam's team, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. Donovan began without preamble, his voice smooth and confident. He laid out their position with practiced ease. He cited state law regarding marital property. He noted that while Mr. and Mrs. Kellen had been separated for 7 years, no legal divorce had ever been finalized. Therefore, Aurobild LLC, having been founded during the legal marriage and having achieved its entire valuation during the legal marriage, was unequivocally a marital asset. "And it is quite an asset," Donovan said, sliding a thick bound document across the table. "We've had a preliminary valuation of the company conducted. Based on current contracts, intellectual property, and market position, we estimate Aurobild's worth to be in the range of $400 million. He paused for effect. "Mrs. Kellen is prepared to be reasonable. She is not asking for a controlling interest. She is simply asking for her legal and moral due, 50% of the company's value to be paid out in a structured settlement, $200 million. Sarah sat beside him, a smug, vindicated look on her face. This was her moment of triumph. The look in her eyes said it all. "See what you threw away? See what I am now owed?" Liam did not flinch. He did not look at the valuation. He did not look at Sarah. He simply looked at his own lawyer. Arthur Vance, who had been listening with his eyes closed as if bored, slowly opened them. He gave Liam a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The gambit was set. The trap was ready to be sprung. "Mr. Donovan," Arthur began, his voice a soft, dry rasp that commanded attention, "that is a fascinating and well-prepared presentation. Your grasp of community property law is, I'm sure, exemplary." He steepled his fingers, his gaze calm and academic. "However, it appears your client may have omitted a rather crucial piece of information from her history of events." Arthur reached into his own slim leather briefcase and retrieved a single thin folder. It looked insignificant next to the thick, bound valuation Donovan had presented. He opened it and took out a small stack of papers held together by a single clip. He slid the folder across the vast, polished table. It stopped directly in front of Donovan. "I believe you'll find this pertinent," Arthur said quietly. Donovan picked up the folder with a flicker of annoyance, his confidence unshaken. He opened it. His eyes scanned the first page. Then he stopped. He read it again, more slowly this time. The predatory smile on his face faltered, then vanished completely. He looked up at Sarah, a deep frown creasing his brow. "What is this?" he asked her, his voice no longer smooth. Liam knew exactly what he was looking at. It was a document titled Marital Settlement and Separation of Assets, dated 7 years and 3 weeks ago. Liam had paid a paralegal $200 to draft it in the weeks after Sarah had left. It was simple, straightforward, and brutal in its clarity. It listed the assets they had at the time: a used car, the contents of a joint savings account totaling just over $5,000, the furniture in the house, and one other item. The item was listed as Aurabuild, LLC, a speculative business venture. Donovan's eyes were fixed on the key paragraph. Liam knew it by heart. The parties agree that Sarah Kellen shall receive the full balance of the joint savings account, sole ownership of the 2008 Honda Civic, and all household furnishings as listed in Appendix A. In consideration for this, Sarah Kellen hereby waives any and all current and future claims, interest, or entitlement to the business entity known as Aurabuild, LLC. The parties acknowledge that said business entity has a current operational value estimated at $1, and that its future prospects are entirely speculative. This waiver is final and irrevocable. At the bottom of the page was Sarah's signature in the same flawless looping cursive from the goodbye note, and next to it Liam's own signature, accompanied by the embossed official seal of a notary public. "Sarah, did you sign this?" Donovan demanded, his voice a low, furious growl. Sarah's face had gone the color of ash. She stared at the paper as if it were a ghost. I don't remember. He gave me some papers. I was upset. He tricked me." "It seems my client didn't trick anyone," Arthur Vance interjected calmly. "He simply memorialized an agreement your client was all too eager to accept at the time, as it gave her all of the liquid assets, the cash and the car, and left my client with all of the debt, a failing business, and the sole responsibility of caring for his minor sister. He honored his side of the agreement. He never asked for the car back. He never asked for a penny of the money. He simply accepted the terms she agreed to." Donovan stared at the notarized seal on Liam's signature. He stared at the irrevocable waiver clause. He understood. The document signed by Sarah when Aurabuild was worthless effectively severed it from the marital estate from that day forward. It was a preemptive strike Liam had laid 7 years ago, a landmine of perfect legality waiting patiently in a safe deposit box. Sarah's greed had finally led her to step on it. The shark-like lawyer slowly, deliberately closed the folder. He pushed it back across the table. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and fury. He stood up, smoothing down his expensive suit jacket. "My services on this matter are concluded," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You have fundamentally misrepresented the facts of your case, and you have wasted my time." He gave a curt, angry nod to Arthur Vance. "Arthur." Then he turned and walked out of the conference room without a backward glance at the woman who had hired him. Sarah was left alone, staring at the closed folder, the instrument of her own undoing. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a siren. She looked up at Liam, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You planned this," she hissed. "You let me believe. You waited all these years just to humiliate me." Liam finally spoke, his voice not triumphant, not angry, but as cold and hard as polished stone. "No, Sarah. I didn't plan for your return. I prepared for it. There's a difference. 7 years ago, you made a choice. You valued a used car and $5,000 more than you valued me, my sister, or my worthless dream. I simply accepted your valuation. This document is not my humiliation of you. It is your own signature testifying to your own choices. My lawyer will file for the divorce tomorrow on the terms outlined in this agreement. You will receive nothing more from me, ever. He stood up. Elena stood with him. They were a single, solid unit. He had built his defense with the same meticulous care he used to build his skyscrapers, on a solid foundation of fact, with no room for emotional error. The confrontation was over. The structure of her attack had collapsed under its own flawed design. The aftermath of Donovan's departure was not the explosive climax Sarah might have imagined. Instead, it was a rapid, pathetic collapse. Her fury dissolved into a torrent of desperate, ragged sobs. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful, wronged woman crumbled, revealing the desperate, grasping person underneath. She pleaded, she begged. She tried to appeal to the memory of the man he used to be, the softer man who might have been moved by her tears. But that man no longer existed. He had been a casualty of the wreckage she had caused, and the man who had been built in his place was immune to her manipulations. Liam and Elena did not engage. They did not argue or gloat. They simply turned and walked toward the door, their footsteps echoing in the silent, cavernous room. Her cries followed them into the hallway, but they did not look back. There was no triumph in her complete and utter defeat, no joy in witnessing her self-inflicted destruction. There was only a profound and sudden lightness, as if a great, heavy chain he had been dragging for 7 years had finally been uncoupled from his ankle. The last piece of debris from the old demolition site had been cleared. The past was, at last, truly past. They rode the elevator down in a comfortable silence, the air between them charged not with tension, but with relief. As the doors opened into the sunlit lobby of the aura-build tower, his tower, their tower, Elena reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, grounding. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw in her eyes the reflection of their entire journey. The late nights in the dusty workshop, the shared anxiety over impossible deadlines, the quiet joy of their first big success, the steady, unwavering partnership that had become the central pillar of his life. The years of accumulated tension, the quiet, ever-present vigilance he had maintained, finally drained from his face. A genuine, unburdened smile touched his lips. Standing by the soaring glass entrance, bathed in the afternoon light, was Chloe. She was no longer the haunted girl he had found crying in her room. She was a poised, confident young woman on the cusp of her own brilliant future, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, a warm smile on her face. She had come to meet them for dinner, a simple weekly ritual that had become one of the load-bearing structures of their family. As they stepped out of the building and onto the bustling city street, Liam paused and looked up. He tilted his head back, his gaze traveling up the 30 stories of steel and glass, a shimmering monument to his resilience, his patience, and his work. For years, he had seen it as the ultimate symbol of his victory, the physical proof that he had not only survived but conquered. It was his empire. But now, standing here with Elena's hand in his and his sister waiting for them, he understood. The building was just a building. It was an impressive, magnificent object, but it was hollow. His true empire was not the corporation or the skyscraper. It was this. It was the quiet, unshakable loyalty of the woman beside him. It was the bright, promising future of the young woman before him. It was the family he had built from the broken pieces of a life, a structure founded on love, respect, and shared creation. Chloe walked up to them, her eyes searching his face. She had felt the tension of the past week, the unspoken weight of the impending confrontation. "So," she asked softly, her voice filled with a hope that was almost fearful, "is it over?" Liam looked away from the tower and into Elena's eyes, seeing the city lights, the sky, and their entire future reflected there. He squeezed her hand, a simple, profound confirmation. The last ghost had been exorcised. The final account had been settled. The foundation was clear. "Yes," he said, his voice full of a peace that had been 7 years in the making. "Let's go home."